stability for the creatives requires the integration of these different practices. We have to be able to make compelling business arguments.
The future could lend itself towards a much more blended production where you don't have to be so role-based or fixed.
We're leaving so much money on the table. Like, there's so much opportunity to figure out new, better ways to do things.
Welcome to the Creative Ops Roundtable. My name is Adrian. I'm your host and the co-founder of Creative Queue. Our goal in these sessions is to bring together professionals across disciplines within advertising and retail to have a grounded and no BS conversation that can help us navigate the seismic changes that are transforming our industry. Today, with my co-host Ittai Korman, I'm joined by two guests for a conversation about the relationship between brands and creatives and what both groups can do to gain leverage, bridge gaps, and make more of an impact together. Sharon Joseph is an Emmy Award-nominated creative production professional with experience at ad agencies and enterprise content studios like Creative Drive and Industrial Color. After many years in consulting, Sharon is now the director of BTS at content operations platform Shopflow. Lauren Rogala is a 10-year creative director and art director with agency and in-house experiences at places like MM LaFleur, Cole Haan, and the Lion Studios. She also recently founded Nimble Creative, a new agency focused on creating impactful, human-centered stories that drive brand goals and connect with customers. We started the conversation with the question, does it matter if clients and stakeholders actually understand production?
That's always going to be, and always has been, a hurdle in what we do, is getting people to really understand what the costs are, what goes into it, what manpower goes into it. The big change now is not necessarily like getting people to understand production as a whole, but how the connectivity would make things so much better and richer and more performative and more engaging. As a creative director, I can explain to someone in finance, I can explain to someone in marketing and merchandising, like, here's what goes into a shoot that makes it successful, and this is why we need these resources. My biggest challenge is being able to say, to make this even better, here's what I need from you, and here's what I need to understand from your teams, and then figuring out how to bring that complexity deeper into production. Because right now I feel like things are getting very stuck at like, oh, well, this is how things have already been done. And like, we understand we need all of these components in production. We understand the cost of it. We understand the efficiencies and the different levers we can pull to get those efficiencies, but it's beyond the conversation of efficiency, and it's more of an efficacy question. How can we get more complex and deeper without ruining the lives of the people in production and making them crazy and unbearable and
And compromising on performance at the same time, because I think those two things often come hand in hand, where it's like when you water down the process element or the focus on the impact, then you're also compromising the continuity of your workforce at the same time. Those two things are often like one lever that's actually affecting two variables, and that's not super well understood either. But I think that's kind of a nice transition into things that I know that you're talking about or thinking about, Sharon, which is really about the role that data plays inside of production. Because I think that bringing data into the creative process from a creative perspective has been very much like a dirty word or a dirty concept, or we don't want to do that. Do you have any thoughts about the role that data is supposed to play?
One, production is a loose definition, right? It can mean a lot of things. You could be producing a lot of different things. And in our world, production has a lot of subjectivity. The unfamiliarity of what actually goes into a production, couple that with the volume that has to be put through that undefined process. And then the lack of understanding of what's even required to have it be an effective process, as Lauren just described, budgetary needs, environmental needs, or the process needs or the people needs are always evolving. And so the only thing that can help thread it together in a sane way is data. It's no different than the way that a brand runs their manufacturing supply chains and their distribution houses and their delivery services. They need data in order to inform those processes to be effective so that there's no break in the system of production. And so by having the access to data to inform the production, you can have a whole lot more effectiveness. It's a 4-letter word that seems to be avoided a lot, especially by creatives, because it seems like it's a confining scenario to have data inform your process, or your process informs more data, it's still going to be much more effective at the volume of content production that we're seeing. It's different than smaller retailers. It's a little easier to have the flexibility in creative. I think there's different challenges there for production. I've done small brands. How do I squeeze a meaningless budget just to do something so that we can have some sort of content? It's hard. It's hard to even rationalize that in a smaller scale. And so you have the pendulum swing of, if you don't understand what goes into production at any scale, then it makes the whole process bearable. We've been doing it. We can see it. There is content out in the world and people are buying products, but it puts a strain on it, for sure.
One would think for the biggest players have the most leverage in the space, but I think it's so common where you see larger brands looking at the really amazing creative work that smaller brands are doing and being like, hey, like we want to tap into some of that. And then you have the smaller brands being like, yeah, we want to compete with these people. Like, how do we get there? And both from a mindset perspective, from an operations perspective, from an artistic perspective, there's amazing value and lessons to learn on both sides.
I have a scenario like that, not only between, a smaller brand admiring a bigger brand or vice versa, aspirationally, but inside of a brand where there was the brand studio and there was the e-com studio. And I ran the e-com studio, and aspirationally, we wanted to do the brand work. And the brand team couldn't get the volume at the quality that was required done on the e-com side. Through our processes and efficiencies and inspiration, we were able to find the opportunities with the merchants to say, let's schedule one Friday a month. That's the play day in the e-com studio. That allows the e-com team to do non-e-com work, and the merchants to explore the talents of the e-com team and not even have to wait for the brand team to either do it or say that it's going to cost too much. So it's kind of nice to see that opportunity within a brand that you can have productions in two different capacities. You can have talent and resources in two different capacities, but the learnings of those production processes are good for the SOPs that you need for output, but they're also there for opportunity too. The future could lend itself towards a much more blended production where you don't have to be so role based or fixed, and allow that flexibility. But again, it needs to be driven by some sort of information. You can't afford flexibility or that inspiration or aspiration if you don't have the operating system for any process in place, because it just makes it hard to put a team in the extra space or the adaptive space.
I am really curious, though, how the brand team felt about that solution.
I mean, the brand team have the bigger things. This was mostly social media projects because they were sort of undervalued by the brand team. The e-com team is not producing brand content every day, but they are touching your brand every
Yeah.
day. Like I tune out a little. I don't think it was a big effect. I think it worked out for all parties, and maybe the brand team didn't even know. Who knows?
Well, that makes me happy that it wasn't an issue.
I like that because there's an empowerment narrative there. People who work in these different areas, whether it's social media, whether it's the paid marketing, whether it's the e-com, whether it's the brand and editorial, there's this segmentation, like this is what we do and we don't do that stuff. Or, this is what we do and we'd love to try to do that stuff. But it's a shame about that on the brand level. If you are overly segmenting in that way and encouraging the lines to be drawn between the people who work on these different groups, you're actually missing out on a ton of excitement and value and engagement in the process from a who's working on it perspective. There's so much untapped potential there that you don't even have to pay extra money for in order to unlock. Having the bandwidth built in where you can occasionally challenge people who are in different groups to be doing work that they usually don't do, you can unlock these things that you kind of already have invested in that you can't see because the structure that you built from a process perspective hides that potential.
What's interesting to me is hearing the resistance, and I'm hearing like a couple of threads. One is political between teams, some is technical, some is cultural. I'm wondering if there are any other rubs or resistances.
To me, there's sort of that divide between larger brands and the more medium and small brands. And that's where I see a lot of this resistance because to me, it doesn't make any sense to not test everything constantly all the time. Understanding what's working, what's not, and then where's the extra 10 or 20% that you can improve on top of that. What's popular, what's interesting, like what's working now isn't going to work, 3 months from now, 6 months from now, a year from now, however much it may be. So like this idea of continually testing, I think is really important. And I think it's something that smaller brands, in my experience, have been more open to doing because they're less risk averse than larger brands. They're willing to step out and try new things. A lot of the larger companies that I've worked with, there's this sort of like, this is how we do it. We've like finally figured out a system that works for us. So why would we change it? I find that incredibly frustrating. We're leaving so much money on the table. Like there's so much opportunity to figure out new, better ways to do things, but we're sort of handcuffing ourselves to this thing that we took a long time to figure out that sort of works right now. And we all kind of understand it. It's like, let's not touch it because we don't want to break it.
Can you give an example of what testing means? What does a fully fleshed out test look like or feel like?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it has to be anything crazy or complex. If we're talking about e-commerce imagery, it's something as simple as adding an extra shot or an extra set of selects at the end of the day for like a best-selling product that you're going to be driving traffic to or is a big traffic driver, and getting some variation in assets. Like the visual trends of what's working change constantly. The wall and floor that was ubiquitous for the last 3 years is suddenly very old looking and like seamless is back in. And sort of having this more like continuous natural light feel. It's like, okay, well, what if we at the end of the day took 45 minutes, made a quick light and set change, grabbed that best-selling product in a new style, and put that up as an A/B test on that page that we're already driving a ton of traffic to and see what performs better before you get into like, oh, let's do a full shoot and like put this big investment into something. Whether you're going to see traction or not with no financial risk other than maybe getting like one less look done from your existing shoot.
I think there's something there where when change of content strategy is going to happen, the tendency is like you hired a new creative director and we're going to like burn everything that we did to the ground completely and then move in a completely new direction based off of someone's gut feeling and assume all of the risk that's a part of that all in one bite, as opposed to splitting that up into smaller, more financially easy to swallow bites and more politically easy to swallow bites. What do you think, Sharon?
I think testing is a great way to keep adaptation, and to answer Itai's question about barriers, I see time being the biggest barrier. The time that it takes to even survive a production day and then go into the next one, there is not enough time to do the next adaptation that you might be considering. And at the juncture that somebody's getting in touch with Shopflow, they're probably at such desperation of needing a system. They don't have the bandwidth to even talk about the things that we need them to talk about to implement successfully because they're at capacity. To have that empathy that the production industry is at such a time constraint, even strategizing a new process. There's that fear that if you don't get product live that happens to be in inventory, then there's that time and that cost of on hand but not online. You're constantly behind schedule by the nature of the industry as it's manifested today. And it doesn't allow you to even rationalize the needs up to leadership or cross-reference even just other departments and say, hey, let's actually work through this in a different way. It's sort of unnerving for another department. Aren't you supposed to be in your production hole, getting all the stuff done? Because we don't have the bandwidth to actually have that connection and collaboration. The ones that are overcoming those barriers are investing their time separately in the creative ops mindset. They're investing in the planning, or the studio managers are collaborating with creative directors to say, yes, let's find that time so that you can test. Because if we don't autonomously lead in that direction and gaining ourselves time and gaining ourselves authority, we can do much more. It's just we're at this big time constraint.
What do you feel like the major variable that impacts the ability to create time? Like where do you feel like the largest impediments are there?
Miscommunication is the biggest time suck. If you cut away all the erroneous touch points, you more specific and poignant about the areas that we do need this communication, and adapt other areas because it tends to be a miscommunication is probably the biggest time suck.
That's where the data can step in to take the place of the communication. It's the data that can help provide the trust to be like, yeah, take this and do something interesting and do something impactful and do something compelling. A lot of the interpretation becomes much more objective, where you can make your bets as a creative based off of something that's actually in the interest of the business, as well as in the interest of the quality of the content. And those two things can meet without as much negotiation.
I feel like it's a motivation thing, at least from like a on-set perspective, rather than a time or time suck thing. It's sort of, can we create the environment to where like we still get everything done we need to get done and do a little extra, which is hard to convince people when they feel like dragged down and this is not fun. We don't like what we're doing. So how do you sort of create the motivation and environment that frees up time, which is kind of I guess, a weird way to think about it. But I was on a sheet this week where we overshot our numbers every day by a significant margin and wrapping at 4:30. We very easily could have shot some like cool test things or like fun editorial things or something like that. But we were also exhausted by the end. And we were like, our brains are done. Like we have nothing left to give. And we would rather just leave than sort of like push that extra bit. We can create the time. It's just, do we really want to as creatives and people in this process and doing all of these things?
I feel like from my perspective, part of creating motivation comes from taking steps on a brand level to make sure that the creative people who are involved like actually understand the impact that they're having. Why should I care to muster the energy to do a little bit more when like it all just feels like I'm throwing stuff down the bottom of a well that I never see again? That kind of ties to, are the brands actually leveraging everything that's being created in the most effective way? Am I seeing my work providing impact, or are those images sitting in an asset management system and never being used? This comes back to what efficiency means. You can take the principles of optimization and apply them to the human energy variable, or apply them to the time and quality and experimentation variables. Leverage doesn't come just from making sure that those costs are controlled. Leverage comes from thinking about all these variables in a more holistic way. If you're doing it right, you don't have to bite off all the risk at the same time, and things can even themselves out.
But I love the autonomy of the individual team or the production day that Lauren just described, because, it's not just the responsibility of the brand. I think as professionals and individuals, and maybe as the collective or the group on any given production, you have the ability to motivate and manage accordingly. The time gain could either be towards other work that you want to do or for yourself. And that's part of the investment in you as a capable human within the organization that you're working for. Brands are going through these ebbs of org changes, individuals coming in and they like the cachet of the name, the role. Over time, that relationship deteriorates. Where do you see these barriers, taking hold over time, on the individuals?
I feel like you were describing my life for the last 3 years in what you were just saying. To be just very transparent with you, I've literally been that creative who's changed jobs like 6 times in the last 3 years, and now I'm freelancing. So if that gives you any sort of insight into how I feel about it, it's truly a bad situation right now in the world of brands and being an in-house creative at brands. And the turnover is incredibly high. They're looking for fresh talent. They're looking for new ideas and sort of different ways to think about things. And that's sort of the conversation that you go in with, is this like, oh, we really like how you think about this. This is a new way of thinking. It's different from what we've been doing, and we're really excited about that. And then you get in there and you hit those blocks and barriers very, very quickly of, well, what if we did it like this? Like, here's a new perspective, a new idea. And you sort of immediately get the pushback of, well, that's not how we've done it before. I've gotten that over and over again where I've been hired because I have new ideas about ways to do things and ways to approach things. And literally a month in, they're like, no, we're not going to do any of that, even though that's when we were hiring you, what we said we wanted you to be here for, which is really frustrating. And it's also incredibly frustrating to try to think outside of the box and try to come up with solutions and just be met with resistance over and over again, but not resistance that's backed or supported by data, any sort of actuals that inform it. I think a really good example is working with a women's wear brand, and I made the suggestion of having more variation in body type that we were casting. And they were like, oh, well, that's really tricky from a sample perspective. And my rebuttal was like, I totally get that. But every season, you're also refreshing evergreen product that you have in stock in all sizes. So how about we devote a portion of that evergreen product to expanding our size and diversity and casting? And the response was, oh yeah, I guess that would work, but we're not going to do that because we've never done it. And we don't know if our customer would respond positively or negatively to that. And we don't want to spend the money or take any time to see if it would be a positive or negative response. So we're just going to stay with what we've always done, which again, as both a consumer and a creative, is really frustrating because, as a consumer, I feel very disappointed by what I see from brands now of like, why aren't people showing more diversity in body type? Like, why aren't we getting content that's more creative and more connected and more interesting? Why isn't the e-com serving us better? Like, why can't we see the fabric? Why don't we have video? Why don't we have different ways to style things? And then on the creative side of it, I know why we don't because I've been on that side of the conversation of it's too expensive. It's not worth the risk. We don't know. We don't have the data to back it up either way. So we're just not going to try. Or like we have tried 3 years ago and it didn't go well or it was too expensive. So we're not going to try again. Anyway, that was sort of a long diatribe of my
Well, and if you don't mind me asking, in any of your transitions out of a brand, was it on your own volition, or was it because they went through a reorg? And were you part of a creative reorg, or were you a solo reorg?
both. Both.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What happens at that point where reorgs are happening in the creative department? What is the brand? What do you assume the brand is going through in order for that change to happen?
Yeah. So in my experience and where I see the huge blind spot that's happening sort of over and over again is sales are down. Things aren't performing as well as they used to. They understand that something needs to change, but there's a break of being willing to take the risk to actually make the changes when it comes down to it. Fundamentally, what the blind spot is that the customer in the market has changed really, really drastically, especially since COVID. Brands haven't caught up to that yet. They haven't had the money to catch up to it yet because retail was so damaged by COVID and all of the after effects of it. So to me, that's kind of where that like gap is like the customer is in a really different place, but brands just haven't had the money to adapt to it yet.
Yeah, I would add to that by saying that there's an assortment strategy variable there as well. I think
Yeah.
that one of the really easy ways that brands perceive that they can kind of like dig themselves out of a difficult situation is to say, okay, well, we're going to expand our products and sell more products and sell more different products. While that's not necessarily something that contributes to this compounding negative race to the bottom, it can very easily make it much harder for creative to tell a compelling story.
So what's an empowered creative supposed to do? We can't expect brands to change this. They're not flexible enough to change. And so from the inside out, knowing that, there's a huge underemployed, creative market out there, and everyone's sort of experiencing the same change. And so with this dialogue, what should we empower a creative to do, at these brands if they happen to be there, or if they're interviewing for their next job? How do we expect change?
I have a theory and an answer to this. I think a huge part of it is for creatives to take ownership over the business side of things. I think creative, traditionally speaking, has had their head in the sand of understanding the impact of their work And to the point of the KPIs being really difficult to track, understanding the impact a creative decision can have on how something sells or how it doesn't sell, taking ownership of that, having that conversation with their cross-functional partners, with other parts of the business can be a really empowering way to like open those channels of communication and sort of basically talk people into trying new things by infusing that creative perspective with the business perspective as well, and say like, hey, I understand that like we have budget constraints, we have logistic constraints, we have time constraints. Like there are things that are outside of this creative land that impact what we're doing, but what we're doing can also impact those things as well. And we understand that and can have a conversation about it in a way that's really meaningful.
One of the unfortunate byproducts of where we're living right now, nobody from any of the other departments is going to make themselves responsible for the impacts of the work that the creatives are making. The creatives have to learn more about what other people do and learn how to speak the language of the other people who are involved. Medium to long-term stability for the creatives requires the integration of these different practices to find sustainability. It's not just about our subjective feelings and the art that we want to make. This is still retail. This is still commerce. And we have to be able to make compelling business arguments about why we should be doing one thing or why we should be doing something else. You have to be the one who steps up because nobody else is going to do that because they're all thinking about their own stuff.
I'm starting to think of like capabilities that creatives need in 2025 and beyond. At a certain point, a creative needed a portfolio or needed a website. Like those were capabilities that you needed to have in order to be capable of your job, you know? And so now there's so much more for you as a creative to be successful. And I'm curious what that list is, you know, and maybe it becomes a course, you know, like maybe it becomes something that says like, here, this is the tool set that we think creators should use in order to be successful.
Thanks, Sharon.
It's like understanding each part of the business and like how it works. Like, how do buys work? How are those decisions made? Why are they made? What's the basic theory and fundamentals of like awareness, like general funnel? Like, there's so many creatives I feel like who don't know what the funnel is, like a marketing funnel, almost business 101. Like, they need a business course.
So it's not just a toolage thing, but it's also an expertise thing or like a working knowledge thing.
Yeah, so that they have the vocabulary to ask the right questions, even if they don't understand their particular brand's buying strategy. Like, what are some different buying strategies that exist that different brands leverage? And then they can ask the intelligent question to the buying team. Hey, are you thinking about big buys in this way? Or are you thinking about like risky buys in this way? Like, how are you thinking about building out a line? And what is the thought process that goes into that and different ways you can think about it? I had really supportive bosses who I was like, hey, I don't understand how or why this works. Can you tell me who I can talk to understand this? Because I connected the dots very quickly that it affected and impacted directly what I was doing. It's like having the support from the people around you, having the right resources of people to talk to like break it down for you and understand. And to MM's credit, like they really, really valued cross-functional communication and collaboration. They did silly corporate things where we had to like shadow someone on a different team for a day every quarter. They like facilitated that to such an extreme. But in bigger companies, that can be really hard to do because you're so siloed. And especially in like hybrid work environments, it's even harder because nobody's there half the time. Pre-COVID, when like people had budgets to do things, we did a lot of leadership and management training where they brought together the same level of people across different departments. So if you were like an associate or a manager or a senior manager, and they brought you all into a roundtable discussion once a month to talk about like your particular area of the business. And that facilitated a ton of conversation. You'd get people from different areas being like, oh, well, have you thought about this? Like, this is how I usually deal with these problems. And it sort of created this really nice communication where you really started to understand the full scope of the business. But I was lucky. It's like the short answer is I was in a good environment that fostered that.
It's one of those funny things where actually the size of the company, as you were saying, like does matter a lot. Like when you're working at a smaller brand, there's actually a lot of value from a learning perspective. You accidentally get to be part of a lot of conversations that would be siloed when the teams are bigger and the jobs are more segmented and the processes are different. For creatives who are thinking about the trajectory of their careers, obviously there's a compensation and a money part of that where like, yeah, sometimes a small brand can't pay you as much, but there's value for like young versions of any of the disciplines to go into smaller companies in a more startup sense. You're going to naturally get a better working knowledge from those companies because it's just more visible than at the larger companies, even though that larger company might come with a cachet and the pay bump at the brand level. I think one of the important things is, if we're getting together once a month to have an open table discussion, that's not the same as getting together twice a week and having a conversation about like the conversion metrics of the website, right? Those are two different conversations that need to be given space in order for something holistic to happen. Having a conversation that's almost like more of a philosophical and emotional conversation is a completely different exercise than having a conversation about, what did we do? What happened? Did it work? Did it not work? Those quantitative conversations need to be paired with really powerful qualitative conversations, because the data and the numbers are affected by all of this qualitative information and these qualitative variables. That is all for today. Thank you so much for listening. We are super excited to bring you more thought-provoking conversations that can help you in your journey. If you want to know when we post new episodes, subscribe below or follow Creative Queue on LinkedIn. If you want to learn more about us or any of our guests or partners, we have a full breakdown in the description. And finally, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to send those to team@creativequeue.io. We absolutely love to hear from you and look forward to addressing questions in future episodes. See you next time.